The stone beneath the sand. The plow caught on something it should not have caught on. It was the spring of 1928. A farmer was working a strip of dry coastal land in northern Syria, near a place the locals called Minet el Beida, the White Harbour. He was an Alawite peasant, a man who knew this soil the way a man knows the lines on his own hands. And on this morning, his blade struck stone. Not a field stone, not a buried boulder, something cut. Something shaped, something that had been placed there by human hands in an age so distant that no living memory carried it forward. He cleared the dirt with his fingers. What he uncovered was the roof of a tomb chamber, sealed for more than 3,000 years. Inside lay broken pottery, fragments of a world that had ended before Moses was a name in any human mouth. Word reached the French Mandate authorities. By the following year, an archaeologist named Claude Schaeffer arrived from Strasbourg, leading what they called the Mission de Ras Shamra. And on the afternoon of May the 14th, 1929, as the sun began its slow burn down over the Alawite Mountains to the east, a workman named Mohammed Morsal stopped his digging. Something at his feet had the look of a small brick. He brushed it with his palm. It was a clay tablet, inscribed in a script no one alive had ever seen. There would be more, hundreds more, then thousands. What Schaeffer's team had stumbled into was a buried city. The locals called the mound Ras Shamra, the hill of fennel, for the wild plant that grew across its slopes. But the city beneath had another name, an older name, written on the tablets themselves, Ugarit. A great Canaanite trading port that had flourished from the 14th through the 12th centuries before the Common Era and then died, suddenly and violently, around the year 1200, swept away in the firestorm that historians now call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture it. Late Bronze Age, Ugarit. The harbour crowded with cedar-hulled ships from Cyprus, from Egypt, from the Aegean. The smell of salt water and tar and roasting fish. Donkey caravans climbing the streets. A scribal school where boys, 10 and 11 years old, pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay using sharpened reed styluses. The clay would dry in the sun on the school's flat roof, and then it would be filed away, and there it would sit, slowly cooling into stone for the next 3,200 years. That is what Schaeffer's workmen were pulling out of the dirt. Not just objects, a library. A civilization that had gone silent and was now, after millennia, beginning to speak again. And what it had to say would shake the foundations of the modern world. Because among those tablets were religious texts, long mythological poems, hymns to gods, lists of priestly offerings. And the names that appeared in those texts, scratched into clay by scribes who had never heard of Israel, who had died centuries before the prophet Isaiah was born, were names that anyone raised in the Western tradition would recognize. The supreme god of Ugarit was called El, father of the gods, creator of all living beings, the bull, the eternal king, the kind, the compassionate. He was depicted as an elderly bearded man, seated on a throne, wearing a crown adorned with bull's horns. His wife was the goddess Asherah, and the texts called her the mother of 70 gods. Their sons included Baal, the storm god, Yam, the sea, Mot, death himself, Anat, the warrior goddess. The collective term for these divine beings, used over and over again in the Ugaritic tablets, was a single word, Ilham, the children of El. Now hold that word in your mind for a second, Ilhim. Because if you take the Hebrew Bible, the opening verse of Genesis, and you read it in the original Hebrew, the word for God is not what most people think it is. It is the word Elohim, a word that is, linguistically, a direct cousin of the Ugaritic Ilham, a plural form, the children of El. Read that sentence again, slowly. The first word the Hebrew Bible uses for God is grammatically plural. For centuries, theologians have offered ingenious explanations for this. A plural of majesty, they say, a royal we, like a king referring to himself in the first person plural, perhaps. But there is another explanation, a simpler one. The one the dirt at Ugarit had been quietly waiting to tell us. The word was plural because, in the world that gave birth to that word, the gods were plural too. Here is what I find striking. For more than 2,000 years, the Western religious tradition assumed that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob had stood alone from the beginning. A singular, omnipotent, uncreated presence who had simply revealed himself to a chosen people. That was the story. That was the foundation. But the dirt at Ras Shamra began to tell a different story. Because the patriarchs of Genesis, when you read them carefully, do not call their God by a Hebrew name. They call him El. El Shaddai, God Almighty. El Elyon, God Most High. El Olam, the Eternal God. El Bethel, the God of Bethel. The same name, in every case, as the supreme god of the Canaanite pantheon. The same elderly bearded king sitting on his throne in the Ugaritic poems, surrounded by his 70 children, with his consort Asherah at his side. The biblical scholar Mark Smith, who taught for decades at New York University, put it as plainly as a scholar can. The God of the Hebrew Bible, he wrote, did not arrive on earth as a fully formed deity. He emerged, slowly, through a long process of what Smith called convergence. The qualities of older gods, El, above all, were absorbed into him over centuries. The way I read this, the implication is staggering. The Israelites did not arrive in Canaan and destroy a foreign religion. According to most archaeologists working today, the Israelites began as Canaanites themselves. Their earliest god was the Canaanite high god El. Their earliest divine vocabulary, the very plural noun used in the first sentence of Genesis, came from the same source as the Ugaritic prayers buried in the tombs of Ras Shamra. For an Israelite peasant living in the highlands of Canaan around the year 1100 before the Common Era, there was no sharp line between her religion and the religion of her neighbors in the lowland cities. They worshipped the same father god. They knew the same mother goddess. They told stories about the same divine assembly meeting on the same sacred mountain. This is not a fringe theory. This is the consensus of mainstream archaeology since the 1970s, built on hard physical evidence, inscriptions in clay, pottery in domestic shrines, the architecture of altars, the names on jar handles. The dirt does not lie, and the dirt is talking. Now, none of this requires us to abandon the sacred. A long-time Notre Dame scholar of religion once observed that the human search for the divine is not diminished by being slow, by being layered, by being human. If anything, it is made more remarkable. A faith that emerged through trial and adaptation, and centuries of theological labor is, in some ways, a more honest faith than one that fell out of the sky fully formed. It is a faith that bears the fingerprints of the people who built it. But the story does not end at Ugarit. Because once you accept that the earliest god of Israel was, in some sense, the Canaanite El, a much harder question opens up. A question that took the next 100 years of archaeology to even begin to answer. If El was the high god of Israel's earliest ancestors, then where did Yahweh come from? When does that name first appear in the historical record? Who used it first? What kind of God was he before he was placed at the center of monotheism? And why in the end did he displace El, absorb El, become El, until even the patriarchs of Genesis were rewritten as worshippers of his earlier identity? The answer, when archaeologists finally found it, was not in Canaan at all. It was in the desert, far to the south, in the burning wilderness between Egypt and the Red Sea. Carved into the wall of a temple built by a pharaoh whose own grandfather had ruled before the time of Tutankhamun, the dirt at Ugarit gave us a beginning. The desert would give us a name. And the name, when it was deciphered, would change everything we thought we knew about the origins of the most influential religious tradition in human history. The clay remembers what the textbooks forgot. And the clay had only just begun to speak. The Divine Assembly. There is a fragment of leather, dark with age, kept now in a climate-controlled vault at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. It was pulled from a cave on the western shore of the Dead Sea, where it had lain undisturbed for 2,000 years. The leather is brittle. The ink has faded in places to a ghost. But the words can still be read, and the words are these. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided up the human race, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. That single sentence from Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, was the version of the text that the Jewish community at Qumran was reading and copying in the centuries just before the time of Jesus. It is the version that appears in the Greek Septuagint, the oldest translation of the Hebrew Bible into another language. It is, in all probability, the original reading. But if you open a modern English Bible, in most translations you will find a different sentence. The words "sons of God" have been replaced. They have been replaced with the words "sons of Israel." Someone, at some point, changed the text. Now stop and consider what that older reading actually says. The Most High, the highest God, divided up humanity into nations, and to each nation he assigned a son of God, a divine being, a lesser deity. The borders of the peoples, the verse claims, correspond exactly to the number of these heavenly sons. And the next verse, verse 9, then tells us which son got which nation. Yahweh's portion, it says, is his people Jacob, his allotted heritage Israel. Read those two verses together, in the order they were originally written, and you arrive at a conclusion that the medieval scribes who edited the Hebrew Bible could not tolerate. The Most High and Yahweh are not the same figure. The Most High is the supreme God who allots the nations. Yahweh is one of his sons, the particular divine being assigned to look after the family of Jacob. There is a hierarchy. There is a divine assembly. And in the oldest layer of the text, Yahweh stands within it, not above it. This is not a fringe interpretation. The biblical scholar Mark Smith, the late Frank Moore Cross at Harvard, and many others have argued that this is the plain meaning of the verse when it is read in its earliest preserved form. The medieval Masoretic scribes, working 1,000 years after the verse was first written, could no longer accept what it was saying, so they smoothed it. Sons of God became sons of Israel. The hierarchy was flattened. The assembly was erased. But Qumran preserved the older reading, and Qumran, in its silent way, would not let the secret die. The same divine assembly appears, even more openly, in Psalm 82. The psalm opens with God taking his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. The Hebrew word used twice in that single verse is Elohim, gods in the plural. Real gods, not a poetic flourish. And the rest of the psalm makes clear that these Elohim are accountable beings. They have been judging unjustly. They have been showing partiality to the wicked. They have been failing the orphans and the poor. So the presiding God rebukes them. You are gods, he says, sons of the Most High, all of you. But because you have failed in your duty, you will die like men. Mortal divine beings, condemned for cosmic injustice. This is what the psalm actually says, before centuries of careful editing tried to make it say something safer. Here is what I find striking. The Hebrew Bible itself, in its oldest poetic strata, preserves the memory of a divine council, a heavenly courtroom, a pantheon. The very thing that strict monotheism, in its later confidence, claimed had never existed. If you ask me, the only explanation that fits the evidence is the simple one. There was a time, in Israel's earliest centuries, when this picture was not heretical. It was orthodox. The Most High, called Elyon in Hebrew, sat at the head of a council. His sons, the Bnei Elohim, presided over the nations. And one of those sons, the one allotted to the family of Abraham, was named Yahweh. So the next question, the question that the dirt of Ugarit could not answer, becomes the most urgent question of all. Where did Yahweh come from? When does that name first appear in the historical record? Who used it before the Israelites did? The answer was discovered carved into the wall of an Egyptian temple, 800 miles south of Jerusalem, in what is today the country of Sudan. The temple was built by the pharaoh Amenhotep III, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1390 to 1352 before the Common Era. He was the grandfather of the boy king Tutankhamun. His temple at Soleb, on the left bank of the Nile, was dedicated to the god Amun-Re, and, on one of its columns, among a list of foreign peoples whom the pharaoh claimed to have conquered, a hieroglyphic name ring still survives. The name ring reads, in the most precise transliteration scholars can offer, Tashasu Yewa, the land of the Shasu of Yahweh. The Shasu were not Egyptians. They were a Semitic people, nomads, cattle herders, the kind of Bedouin tribes that drifted through the deserts on the southern fringes of Canaan. The Egyptians knew them well, knew them mostly as a nuisance, raiders and wanderers and occasional rebels. And in this inscription, carved into stone 1400 years before the Common Era, the Egyptians identified one particular tribe of these nomads, not by their territory, the way most peoples were identified, but by the god they followed, Yahweh, the same name, the same god, the same 4 Hebrew consonants, YHWH, the Tetragrammaton, 2 centuries before the Israelites, as a recognizable people, even appear in the historical record. The Egyptologist Donald Redford, who spent his career working through these topographical lists, drew the only conclusion the evidence allows. Yahweh, he wrote, was originally a god of the southern deserts. An Edomite god, perhaps, or a Midianite one, worshipped by nomadic tribes in the regions that the Hebrew Bible itself associates with the divine origin. Seir, Edom, Teman, Paran, the land where Moses, in the biblical narrative, first hears the voice from the burning bush, the land where, the prophet Habakkuk later writes, God comes from. The land where, in the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, Yahweh marches forth from Seir, and the earth trembles, and the heavens drip. The way I read this, the picture comes into focus. Yahweh did not begin in Israel. He began somewhere else, in the burning wilderness south of Canaan, as the patron god of small nomadic tribes who had no temples, no kings, no written texts. At some point, perhaps through trade routes, perhaps through migration, perhaps through a single tribe of Edomites who moved north and joined the highland Canaanites, that god traveled. He arrived in Canaan. And there he met another god, the old god, the high god, the bearded patriarch of the Ugaritic tablets. He met El. What happened next is what Mark Smith called the Convergence. Over the centuries of Israel's early settlement, the centuries when there were no kings yet, no Jerusalem temple yet, only a loose federation of highland villages, the southern desert god and the Canaanite high god slowly fused into one. El's epithets, his attributes, his very identity were absorbed into Yahweh. The patriarchs of Genesis, who in the oldest traditions had worshipped El, were rewritten as worshippers of Yahweh in his earlier form. The Most High and the storm god of Edom became, by the time the monarchy began, a single deity bearing both names. 2 distinct gods, with 2 distinct origins, fused into one. But there is something the Convergence story leaves out, something the strict monotheists who told it, centuries later, did not want to admit. Because in those early days, before the merger was complete, before the priests of Jerusalem had finished their long theological labor, this unified God did not stand alone in the heavens. He had a partner, a consort, a presence so deeply woven into the religious life of ordinary Israelite households that her image survived in their homes, in their pottery, in their burial caves for the better part of 700 years. Her name appeared on storage jars in the desert. Her statues were carved into the figurines that mothers kept beside their cooking hearths. And in one of the most controversial inscriptions ever recovered from biblical-era soil, a man writing a blessing in the 8th century before the Common Era invoked her by name, alongside Yahweh, as though the 2 of them belonged together, as though they always had. Her name was Asherah, and the official history of Western religion has spent the last 2,000 years trying to forget that she ever existed. The Forgotten Queen. What if the God of the Hebrew Bible, for most of the history of ancient Israel, was not alone? What if, for the better part of 700 years, the ordinary people of Judah and Israel believed that their high God had a wife, not in some marginal heretical cult, not at the dusty edges of the kingdom, but in the temple itself, in the city of Jerusalem, in the homes of priests and farmers and kings? What if her image stood inside Solomon's temple for 60 years, openly, with women weaving ceremonial cloth for her in chambers built into the temple walls? This is not speculation. This is what the dirt has been telling us for the last 50 years, and the dirt does not negotiate. Her name was Asherah. In the Ugaritic tablets, the ones pulled from the ruins of the Canaanite city to the north, she was the consort of the high god El, the mother of 70 gods, Lady Athirat of the sea. She walked, the texts said, on the waves. Her epithet was Kudshu, the Holy One. She was depicted in Egyptian artwork from the same period, standing on the back of a lion, holding 2 serpents in her outstretched hands. She was, in other words, one of the great mother goddesses of the ancient Near East, a figure as old as civilization itself. And the official story, the one the textbooks told for centuries, was that the Israelites rejected her completely. Their God was masculine, singular, jealous. He tolerated no rival. He certainly tolerated no wife. And then, in 1975, an Israeli archaeologist named Zeev Meshel led a small team of volunteers into the burning emptiness of the northeastern Sinai desert. They were going to a remote hilltop the local Bedouin called Kuntilat Ajrud, the solitary hill of the water source. Meshel and his volunteers spent 2 seasons there, 3 short campaigns. And what they pulled out of that hill changed the study of ancient Israelite religion forever. There were 2 main buildings on the site, dated by carbon analysis to between 801 and 770 before the Common Era. Inside the larger building, they found inscriptions on the plaster walls. Inscriptions cut into stone vessels, and, most stunning of all, inscriptions written in ink across 2 enormous storage jars called pithoi, each one weighing about 30 pounds. The pithoi were painted with figures, animals, stylized humans. And running across the rim of one of them, in the early Hebrew script of the 8th century, were words that no one had ever expected to read on Israelite pottery. I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria, and his Asherah. A blessing, a simple, ordinary household blessing, the kind a traveler might receive from a priest at a desert way station before continuing his journey north. And in that blessing, the God of Israel was paired, openly and without apology, with the Canaanite mother goddess, as though she belonged at his side. As though everyone reading those words would understand what was meant. The second jar carried a similar formula. I bless you by Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah. Teman, the same southern desert region where, according to the prophet Habakkuk, Yahweh himself had originated. The 2 earliest associations of the God of Israel, with Samaria in the north and Teman in the south, both came with the same companion, the same divine partner, Asherah. Now hold what this means in your hand for a moment. The standard scholarly view before Kuntilat Ajrud was that any worship of Asherah was a marginal corruption. A few backsliders, some peasants in the hills, the work of foreign queens or wicked kings. The official religion of Israel, the textbooks said, had always been pure monotheism, and the prophets had always opposed any deviation. But this was no peasant shrine. This was a state-supervised desert outpost on a major trade route, and the inscription was not whispered. It was painted in large letters across a 30-pound storage jar, where every literate traveler passing through could read it. This was Orthodox 8th century religion in northern Israel. And then, 8 years before Meshel's discovery, in 1967, an American archaeologist named William Deaver had excavated a tomb at a place called Khirbet el-Kom, 20 kilometers west of Hebron. In the southern kingdom of Judah, he had found another inscription, another blessing. This one carved into the limestone wall of a burial chamber, paleographically dated to the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era. It read, "Blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh, for from his enemies, by his Asherah, he has saved him." Two sites, hundreds of miles apart, north and south, Israel and Judah, a rural caravanserai in the Sinai, and a stone tomb near Hebron, both bearing the same theological formula. The God of Israel and his Asherah, the high God and the goddess, side by side, in the everyday speech of the people who actually lived in the land of the Bible. Here is what I find striking. These were not the first such finds in the dirt of ancient Judah. They were just the most undeniable. Because for more than a century, archaeologists had been pulling something else out of Iron Age domestic sites, by the thousands, and not knowing quite what to do with it. They were called Judean pillar figurines, small clay statues, between 4 and 8 inches tall, of a female figure. The face was either pinched into rough features by hand or molded with curly hair and a careful smile. The body was a simple cylinder, like a tree trunk, like a sacred pole. And rising from that pillar body, unmistakably, were 2 prominent breasts, supported by hands cupped beneath them in a gesture of offering. More than 1,000 of these figurines have been catalogued by archaeologists, over 400 from Jerusalem alone, over 140 from Tel en Naspe. Smaller numbers from every major Judean site of the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. They were not found in temples, they were found in homes, in living spaces, tucked into wall, niches, buried in domestic refuse pits, sitting in courtyards beside cooking hearths. The archaeologist Raz Kletter, who catalogued more than 800 of them in detail in his 1996 study, concluded what most scholars had already begun to suspect. These were not toys. These were not art. They were household devotional objects. They appear in roughly 1 out of every household assemblage of the late Iron Age. 1 pillar figurine, more or less, per family. Mothers, daughters, grandmothers, praying for fertility, for the survival of their infants, for the milk of their breasts. Praying to Asherah. The way I read this, and the way William Dever has argued for decades, the picture this evidence paints is not a story of exception, it is a story of normality. Throughout the centuries of the divided monarchy, in the homes of ordinary Judeans, the worship of Asherah alongside Yahweh was the religion, not a deviation from it, not a corruption of it. The actual lived faith of the actual people. And then there is the temple itself. Open the 2nd book of Kings, chapter 21. There you will find the account of King Manasseh, who reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years, from approximately 697 to 642 before the Common Era. And what does the text say Manasseh did? He took a carved image of Asherah and he placed it inside the Temple of Solomon, not in some side shrine, not on a high place outside the city, inside the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem Temple, the dwelling place of Yahweh. That image stood there for the next 60 years, through the reign of Manasseh, through the reign of his son Amon, into the reign of Manasseh's grandson Josiah. And in the temple precincts, according to 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 7, women wove ritual cloth for the goddess. They had chambers, they had vestments. They had a place in the architecture of the holiest building in the kingdom. In the year 622 before the Common Era, King Josiah finally moved against her. Acting on a scroll discovered during temple repairs, the scroll most scholars now identify as an early form of the Book of Deuteronomy, Josiah ordered the Asherah dragged from the sanctuary. He took her to the Kidron Valley, outside the walls of Jerusalem. He burned her there. He ground her ashes to powder, and he scattered the dust across the graves of the common people. That was the official end of the Queen of Heaven in the religion of Judah, the cleansing, the reform. The day the divine couple was sundered by royal decree on the orders of a king reading from a freshly discovered law. But she did not die quietly. The figurines kept appearing in Judean homes for another 36 years, right up until the Babylonian armies arrived and burned everything that had not already been broken. And only then, only in the smoke of the city's destruction, did the goddess finally disappear from the archaeological record. The dirt remembers her. The textbooks tried to forget. The Crucible of Babylon. Imagine for a moment that Jerusalem had not fallen. Imagine that the army of Nebuchadnezzar, marching west from his capital on the Euphrates in the summer of 587 before the Common Era, had been turned back at the city walls. That King Zedekiah's rebellion had succeeded. That the Temple of Solomon had stood unbroken into the next century, and the next, and the next. If that had happened, the religion practiced in that temple would have looked nothing like what we now call Judaism. There would still have been an image of Asherah in the sanctuary, or its memory still warm on the altar stones. There would still have been altars on every hilltop, sacred poles beside the wells, household figurines on every kitchen shelf. The God of Israel would still have been one God among many, the patron deity of a small kingdom in the hills, jealous perhaps, but not yet alone. The God we now call the God of the West, the God of monotheism, the God of Abraham, as billions today understand him, exists for one reason. The reason is that Jerusalem fell. The siege began in the winter of 589. It lasted, according to the most careful chronologies, more than 2.5 years. Inside the walls, the people ate their own children. The Book of Lamentations, written in the immediate aftermath, says so without flinching. Mothers, the text records, boiled their infants. The high priests starved at their altars. And finally, in the late summer of 586, on a date the rabbinic tradition would later fix as the 9th of the month of Av, the Babylonians broke through. What followed was the systematic dismantling of a civilization. The Temple of Solomon, which had stood for nearly 400 years, was burned to the ground. The royal palace was burned. The houses of the city were burned. The walls were pulled down stone by stone. The sacred vessels of the temple, the gold and the silver and the bronze, were carried away to be melted down or rededicated in foreign sanctuaries. King Zedekiah was caught trying to escape through a breach in the wall. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at the Babylonian field headquarters at Riblah. There, in his presence, his sons were executed. Then his eyes were put out. The last thing he ever saw, the chronicler writes, was the death of his children. Then he was bound in bronze fetters and led across the desert to Babylon, blind, where he died in prison. This was the third deportation. The first had been in 597, when the young King Jehoiachin and about 7,000 of the Jerusalem elite, including the prophet Ezekiel, had already been carried away. The second came after the city fell in 586. A third followed in 582, smaller but no less devastating to the people who lived through it. By the end, the priesthood, the royal court, the scribes, the skilled craftsmen, the entire literate class of the Kingdom of Judah had been transplanted to the alluvial plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Picture them on the road, a long column of men and women in mourning, stripped of their wealth, walking 800 miles into the rising sun. Behind them, a country in ash. Ahead of them, a foreign empire. Their god, they had been told all their lives, was bound to one mountain in one city. That mountain was now smoke. That city was now rubble. By every theological assumption they had ever held, their god was finished. And here is where the story turns. Because the people who arrived in Babylon, exhausted and humiliated, did not become silent. They did not assimilate. They did not melt into the imperial population the way every other deported nation in the ancient Near East had done before them. Instead, they wrote. They wrote in Tel Aviv, the settlement on the canal called Chebar, where Ezekiel sat among the exiles and saw visions of wheels within wheels and a chariot of fire. They wrote in the abandoned cities the Babylonians let them rebuild, where they were free to farm, to trade, to gather in the makeshift assemblies that would one day evolve into the synagogue. They wrote during the long reign of Nebuchadnezzar and through his son Amel-Marduk, who in the year 561 released the elderly former king, Jehoiachin, from his Babylonian prison and gave him provisions from the royal table. For nearly half a century, this exiled scribal class did the most consequential editorial work in the history of religion. According to the dominant scholarly framework, the model first laid out by the German biblical scholar Julius Wellhausen in 1878, the Hebrew Bible we now possess took its final form during this exile and in the decades that followed. Earlier traditions, older songs and stories and genealogies were gathered, reordered, edited, and woven together. The priestly material, the great cosmic opening of Genesis chapter 1, the careful genealogies, the elaborate cultic legislation of Leviticus, all bear the unmistakable signature of priests writing in Babylon. They are formal, liturgical, obsessed with chronology, with order, with separation. The work of men whose entire previous world had been chaos, and who were now in exile, building a new world out of words. Here is what I find striking. The most monotheistic passages in the entire Hebrew Bible were written, almost certainly, in Babylon. Open the book of Isaiah to chapter 45. The prophet, working in exile, declares, "I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God." Open chapter 44. "I am the first, and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God." Strict monotheism, as a clear and uncompromising philosophical position, does not appear in the older layers of the Bible. It appears here. In the writings of the exilic prophets and the priestly editors, working in the shadow of the great ziggurats of Babylon, surrounded by the colossal statues of foreign deities, listening every day to the imperial cult of Marduk, being recited in temples larger than the one their grandfathers had lost. The way I read this, the timing tells us everything. The exiles were not exporting their monotheism to Babylon. They were forging it there, in response to it, against it, as the only theological framework that could possibly survive the destruction of their nation. If Yahweh was just one God among many, then his temple's destruction meant his defeat. He had lost to Marduk. He was finished. But if Yahweh was not one God among many, if he was the only God, the universal God, the God who had used Nebuchadnezzar himself as a tool of judgment against a sinful people, then the destruction of Jerusalem was not a defeat at all. It was a fulfillment, a prophecy, a divine plan. So the priests wrote. They wrote the older traditions into a single coherent narrative. They took the songs of Sinai, the patriarchal stories of El, the ancient covenants, the temple liturgies, and they wove them together with a new theological grammar. There was now only one God. He had always been the only God. The other Elohim, the divine assembly, the consort named Asherah, the storm gods of Edom, and the highland fertility deities, were demoted in a single editorial sweep. They became angels. They became false idols. They became, in some passages, simply nothing at all. The hierarchy that had once organized the heavens of ancient Israel was flattened into a single supreme presence, alone in his sovereignty. This was the great theological revolution of the exile. It was not preached from a mountaintop. It was not spoken in a single voice. It was constructed, page by careful page, in the shabby private scriptoria of a defeated priesthood, working by lamplight in a city that was not theirs. But to make their narrative complete, the exilic editors needed more than theological clarity. They needed a creation story. They needed a flood. They needed an account of the world's beginning that could stand against the imposing cosmologies of Babylon, where every educated person knew the great epics by heart. They had no choice. They had to write a Genesis of their own. And to do that, they reached for the very stories that surrounded them in their captivity, the myths of the empire that had broken them, the cuneiform tablets that lay in every Babylonian temple library, the flood that had drowned the world, the gods who had created man from clay, the 7 days, or 7 tablets, that had ordered the cosmos out of chaos. They were not stealing. According to most scholars working today, they were doing something more interesting. They were taking the prestige literature of their captors and turning it inside out. They were writing a polemic in the form of a creation myth. They were borrowing the architecture of the empire's mythology and replacing its foundations with something the empire could not have produced: a single god, a moral universe, a cosmos spoken into being by a word. The clay tablets had been there in the temple libraries the whole time. The exiles knew exactly where to look. Echoes of the East. How does a story survive the death of the world that birthed it? It survives, sometimes, because someone with a pickaxe accidentally finds it again, 3,000 years too late. In the year 1849, a young Englishman named Austin Henry Layard was digging through a mound of earth in northern Iraq, in the ruins of a city that had been dead since the 7th century before the Common Era. The city was Nineveh, the capital, once, of the Assyrian Empire. And under the collapsed ceilings of its royal palace, Layard's workmen pulled out something that no one in the modern world had been expecting: a library. Not scrolls, not papyrus. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, baked hard by the very fire that had destroyed the building around them. The collected library of King Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian monarch who had assembled, in the middle of the 7th century, every important text his scribes could find: hymns, omens, medical treatises, mathematical tables, and literature, the cuneiform classics of an ancient world that had passed entirely out of memory. The tablets were shipped back to London. They sat in the British Museum for decades, mostly unread. Scholars were still learning how to decipher cuneiform. The script had been lost for so long that the rules of its grammar had to be reconstructed almost from scratch. And then, in the autumn of 1872, a self-taught working-class scholar named George Smith, who had begun life as a banknote engraver and had taught himself to read cuneiform in the museum's reading room, sat down at his desk and began to translate the 11th tablet of an epic poem about a Sumerian king named Gilgamesh. What Smith read on that tablet stopped him cold. He stood up from his chair. According to one account, he began to undress, in his agitation, in the middle of the museum reading room. Because what he was reading was a flood story. Not just any flood story. A flood story in which a man named Utnapishtim had been warned in secret by a god of an impending divine deluge. A man who had built a great boat and had loaded it with his family and with the seed of every living creature. A man whose boat had ridden out a storm of 6 days and 7 nights and had come to rest when the waters subsided on a mountain. A man who had then released a dove from the boat to see whether the waters had receded. The dove returned. He released a swallow. The swallow returned. He released a raven. The raven did not return. He stepped out of the boat. He built an altar. He offered a sacrifice. The gods, the text said, smelled the savor and gathered like flies above the offering. This was the year 1872. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was barely a decade old. The literal historicity of the book of Genesis was still, for most educated Westerners, a matter of religious certainty. And here, on a tablet that had been written down at least 1,000 years before the earliest plausible date for the composition of Genesis, was the story of Noah, almost line for line. The reaction in Victorian England was what you would expect. Newspapers ran the discovery on their front pages. Theologians wrote pamphlets explaining why this proved the Bible right, and other theologians wrote pamphlets explaining why it proved the Bible wrong, and George Smith himself was sent back to Iraq by the London Daily Telegraph to look for the missing fragments of the tablet. Astonishingly, on his second day of digging, he found one. But the flood story was only the beginning, because among the tablets in Ashurbanipal's library was another text, older, in some ways more shocking, a creation epic, the Babylonian counterpart to the opening chapters of Genesis itself. It was called the Enuma Elish, 2 words from its opening line, which means simply "when on high." 7 cuneiform tablets, roughly 1,000 lines of poetry. And it told the story of how the gods of Mesopotamia had brought the world into being. In the beginning, The Enuma Elish says there was only water, the fresh waters of the god Apsu, and the salt waters of the goddess Tiamat. They mingled, and from their mingling, the first generation of gods was born. But the younger gods made noise. They disturbed the primordial sleep of their parents. And Tiamat, enraged, prepared an army of monsters to destroy them. Out of the chaos rose a champion, the young storm god Marduk, patron deity of the city of Babylon. He fought Tiamat in single combat. He shot an arrow that pierced her belly and split her heart. And then, with the goddess of the salt waters dead at his feet, he did the most remarkable thing in the entire poem. He cut her body in half. With one half, he made the dome of the sky. With the other half, he made the foundation of the earth. He set the constellations in their courses. He fixed the moon for the months and the sun for the day. And he created humanity, the text says, from the blood of a slain god, mixed with clay, to bear the labor of the heavens forever. A god creating order out of watery chaos. A cosmos divided into upper waters and lower waters, a separation of darkness and light. Heavenly bodies set as markers of time. Humanity created last, from earth, to serve a divine purpose. The Enuma Elish, in its broad outline, is recognizably the same architecture as the first chapter of Genesis. Not the same theology. Not the same God. Not the same moral universe, but the same skeleton beneath the skin. Here is what I find striking. The Hebrew word in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 for the primordial deep over which the Spirit of God hovers is Tihom. And Tihom, the Hebrew word, is etymologically and almost certainly mythologically related to Tiamat, the saltwater chaos goddess of the Babylonian creation, stripped of her personality, reduced from a divine being to a brute physical condition, but still recognizable in the linguistic root. The Hebrew scribes did not merely know the Enuma Elish, they had read it, they had absorbed it, and then, in the editorial workshops of the exile, they had answered it. The way I read this, what they wrote in Genesis chapter 1 was not an independent creation account. It was a polemic, a theological argument made in the form of a creation story. Where the Babylonian myth had a violent battle between gods, Genesis has a single God speaking quietly into the darkness. Where the Babylonian myth had humans created as slaves of the gods, Genesis has humans created in the image of God. Where the Babylonian myth had a polytheistic pantheon, Genesis has a single creator. Where the Enuma Elish unfolds across 7 tablets, Genesis unfolds across 7 days. The numbers match, the architecture matches, the waters match, the separation of darkness and light matches, the order of creation, more or less, matches, but the theology has been turned inside out. Many traditional theologians, even today, find this disturbing. To them, the parallels seem to threaten the uniqueness of the biblical text. But most modern scholars argue something more interesting. The exilic priests were not stealing from the Babylonians, they were arguing with them. They were taking the prestige cosmology of the empire that had broken Jerusalem, and they were rewriting it from the inside, replacing every element of Mesopotamian theology with a single, austere, monotheistic counterclaim. The Enuma Elish was recited every year, in full, at the Babylonian New Year festival in the Temple of Marduk. The exiled Judean priests would have heard it. They would have heard, year after year, the great hymn declaring Marduk, king of all gods, supreme over heaven and earth. And in their own language, in their own private scriptoria, they composed a quiet refusal. In the beginning, they wrote, God created the heavens and the earth. No combat, no corpse, no army of monsters, no pantheon of younger gods overthrowing older ones. A single voice, a single act, a single sovereign creator who needed no one's help and faced no opposition. It was, perhaps, the most successful theological polemic ever written. 2,500 years later, half the people on earth still recite some version of it, and almost none of them remember that it was written, originally, as a protest song against the gods of an empire that no longer exists. The clay tablets sit silent now, in glass cases in London and Berlin and Baghdad. The cuneiform has been deciphered. The Babylonian gods are studied in graduate seminars. But their architecture, their sequence, their cadence lives on in the opening words of a different book entirely, and every time someone reads those words aloud, the old echoes rise. The final echo. The night the empire fell, no one in Babylon was watching. It was October of the year 539 before the Common Era. The Persian armies of Cyrus the Great had marched south along the Tigris, defeated the Babylonian forces at the river city of Opis, and arrived at the gates of the imperial capital. And the strange thing, the thing the ancient sources keep returning to with a kind of disbelief, is that there was almost no resistance. The gates opened, the garrison stood down. The general Gubaru's Persian troops walked into Babylon on or about the 12th of October, and the daily worship in the temple of Marduk continued without interruption, as though one empire dissolving into another were merely a change of seasons. 2 weeks later, Cyrus himself entered the city. He proclaimed a general amnesty. He paid public homage at the temple of Marduk, the great god of the people he had just conquered. And then, as part of a wider policy of reversing the harsh deportations of the previous Babylonian regime, he issued an edict permitting captive populations across his new empire to return to their ancestral lands and rebuild their sacred shrines. The Judeans had been waiting 48 years. A barrel-shaped clay artifact, about 9 inches long, was placed in the foundation of the Temple of Marduk to commemorate the new policy. It would be dug out of the dirt of Babylon by a British-trained Assyrian Christian named Hormuzd Rassam in March of 1879, and would eventually find its home in a glass case at the British Museum. The Cyrus Cylinder, one of the most copied documents in human history. A foundation deposit. A press release, in essence, for the largest empire the world had ever seen. And the people who had spent 2 generations writing in exile, the priests and scribes and prophets who had quietly forged a new theology in the shadow of the ziggurats, packed their scrolls and began the long walk home. There were several waves. The first, in the year 538, was led by a man named Sheshbazzar, called in the texts the Prince of Judah, who carried with him the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Solomon's temple half a century before. Then came Zerubbabel, appointed governor by the Persian crown, accompanied by a high priest named Joshua. The biblical book of Ezra records that more than 40,000 returned in those early waves. Modern archaeologists, looking at the actual settlement patterns of the period, suggest the number was much smaller, a trickle, the historian Lester Grab has called it. Perhaps 4,000, perhaps fewer, spread out over decades. But what they brought back with them was not measured in numbers. It was measured in pages. They brought a Torah, a unified, edited, theologically coherent narrative of their people, woven from older traditions and refined in the intellectual workshops of Babylon. They brought a strict and uncompromising monotheism, hammered out by the prophet, now known to scholars as Deutero-Isaiah, the anonymous voice behind chapters 40 through 55 of the book of Isaiah, whose declarations rang like iron struck against iron. "I am Yahweh," he wrote, "and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God." They brought, in other words, the religion that the world would come to know as Judaism. And from that religion, in the centuries to follow, would emerge Christianity, and from Christianity, in the 7th century, would arise Islam. More than half the people on earth today live in some way in the long shadow of what those returning exiles carried home from Babylon in their packs. The Second Temple was finally dedicated in approximately 516 before the Common Era, 70 years, almost to the day, after the destruction of the first. It was a smaller building than Solomon's. The old men who had seen the original wept openly when they compared the two. But this temple was different in one crucial way. There was no Asherah inside it. The Queen of Heaven was gone. The divine assembly was gone. The sons of God who had once divided the nations among themselves had been demoted to angels, mere messengers of the one supreme will. The pillar figurines that had filled the homes of pre-exilic Judah disappeared from the archaeological record, and they did not come back. The official religion of the post-exilic community was, for the first time in the history of Israel, what later generations would recognize as monotheism. And the man who had made this possible, the political agent of this theological revolution, was a Persian Zoroastrian who had never set foot in Jerusalem. In the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is given a title that no other foreign ruler in the Hebrew Bible ever receives. He is called Yahweh's Mashiach, his anointed one, his Messiah, the only non-Jew in the entire scripture to wear that title. A pagan king executing the will of a god he did not worship, in fulfillment of a plan he did not understand. Here is what I find striking. The God who emerged from this long process was not the God who had begun it. The God of the patriarchs, in the oldest layers of Genesis, was El, the bearded Canaanite high god, surrounded by his divine family. The God of the early monarchy was Yahweh, the southern desert storm deity who had merged with El and married Asherah. The God of the late kingdom was a Yahweh whose worship was beginning to be exclusive, but who still permitted his goddess consort to stand inside his temple. And the God of the post-exilic community, the God we now read about in Genesis chapter 1, was something new. A single, formless, universal sovereign who had no equal, no spouse, no rival, no peer in any heaven anywhere. The way I read this, what we are looking at is not a single religious revelation handed down once, in a single moment, to a single prophet. What we are looking at is a long evolution. A theological labor stretching across more than 1,000 years, conducted by hundreds of unnamed priests and scribes and prophets, surviving political catastrophe after political catastrophe, refining itself again and again in the kiln of national crisis. The clay tablets of Ugarit gave us the family pantheon from which the patriarchs first emerged. The Celeb inscription gave us the southern desert origin of Yahweh, before he met El, before he was woven into the religion of Israel. The pithoi of Kuntilet Adrud and the figurines of Judean homes gave us the centuries of practical, lived faith in which the goddess Asherah was worshipped alongside her husband. The trauma of the Babylonian exile gave us the editorial revolution that produced strict monotheism. And the Mesopotamian texts of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish gave us the literary architecture against which the exilic priests composed their counter-cosmology. Every one of these layers is still visible in the text we now call the Hebrew Bible. They have not been erased. They have only been overwritten, layer upon careful layer, by editors who could no longer read what they themselves had partially preserved. The plural Elohim still opens Genesis. The divine council still meets in Psalm 82. The sons of God still inherit the nations in Deuteronomy 32. The Asherah still hangs in the verses describing Manasseh's reign. The fingerprints are everywhere, for anyone willing to look. And so we come, finally, to the question that this long story leaves us with. If the deepest scriptures of the West did not fall fully formed from heaven, but emerged slowly, through human hands, across 1,000 years of theological argument and political catastrophe, what does that mean? Does it diminish the sacred? Does it reduce the Bible to mere literature, to mere history, to the residue of a forgotten politics? Some, both believers and skeptics, have read the evidence that way. But there is another reading, a reading the dirt itself seems to invite. The God who emerges from this long process is not less astonishing for being slowly built. If anything, the human search for the divine is more remarkable, more honest, more recognizable when we see it in motion. Generations of mothers praying to Asherah for the lives of their children. Scribes weeping by the rivers of Babylon. A blind king dragged in chains across the desert. A young Persian conqueror who released a captive nation he had never met. A self-taught Englishman in a museum reading room, weeping over a clay tablet that had been silent for 2,500 years. The miracle is not that the message arrived from heaven all at once. The miracle is that it arrived at all, carried across millennia by people who had no idea they were carrying it. People who buried their figurines and copied their scrolls and wrote their prayers and never imagined that someone 3,000 years later would still be listening. The dust of history has settled, but the vibe remains. Keep listening. Keep questioning. This is the Epic History Vibe, signing off.